Nature Aging published a key article in October 2024. It was called The Implausibility of Radical Life Extension in Humans in the 21st Century. The authors were J Olshansky, J Willcox, Lloyd, Demetrius, and Hiram Beltrán-Sánchez. And they concluded there was little supporting evidence that radical life extension would happen anytime soon, like this century. Well, as you know, the beautiful mess that is the longevity industry is a mixture of tribes between pragmatists, immortalists, optimists, and realists. And it's fair to say that those intertribal lines of communication remain very friendly, but sometimes robust on a few occasions. And as the interest in the health span industry and longevity grows, there's a growing polarity between some of those pragmatic and immortalist voices. So I'm joined today by one of those key voices, Professor Eric Verdin, who is President and Chief Executive of the Buck Institute. Eric, how are you?
Very good. Good to see you, Phil.
Great. Well, Eric, I know there's a lot of very interesting chatter on social channels about, obviously, this paper, which was a very interesting paper and a kind of a calibration point for many in the space. Life extension is one of those very, very interesting subjects. We hear all sorts of headlines around the world, but the reality is that human life expectancy from birth has grown in the last century by really up to 30 years. But we've seen a drop off of that recently, and that data in the report talks about that quite a lot. So what's your take on the current state of the human life expectancy that we're all now dealing with?
Yeah, so I'll just step back and just summarize the paper as I read it. And because I think my impression from looking at the reactions online to my comments and other people is that there was a lot of misunderstanding. And so maybe I can try to clear this in terms of how I understood the paper and its implication. What the paper was really addressing is the current state of growth in life expectancy. And as you know, in the last 100, 150 years, we've been gaining life expectancy at 2 to 3 years per decade. And that's by itself is a remarkable achievement. It's brought us essentially to living to 80 on average in most of the Western world. What the paper was asking is, and so based on this gain of 2 to 3 years per decade, the predictions were made by a number of people that, for example, half of currently born children born today would live to be centenarians. That was one of the predictions. And I think that's exactly what the paper was trying to address. It was asking the question, what can we anticipate to happen in the next, let's say, 20, 30 years in terms of growth of life expectancy? Is that rate of 2 to 3 years per decade going to continue? And what the data showed is that between 1990 and 2020, so this is before the COVID pandemic, the rate has slowed down. Yeah. And so this is not caused by the pandemic. It probably indicates a very simple fact, is that as we reach the maximum of what we can attain in terms of life expectancy based on what we know today, it's getting harder and harder. And a very simple reason for this is think back early last century when we were making gains in life expectancy mostly by decreasing child mortality. If you save a life of a kid that's 3 years old, he's got 77 years to gain. So the gains, of course, were much larger. As we get closer and closer to the maximal number of what we can do today, if you save someone's life and you allow them to live an extra 3 years by curing cancer, as has been predicted, you will only gain smaller and smaller number of years on average. This is essentially what the paper is saying. It just, frankly, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I guess it did say that obviously the reality is living to 100, it's 5.1% for females and 1.8% for males based on that cohort data from the past, right? And I guess the reality is that that's a rendezvous with reality. But the concepts of what we're talking about in the space with some very extreme radical science, you're really saying at the end of the day that despite all of that, we're still going to be reaching those lower numbers in expectancy.
Well, this is where the misunderstanding occurred. And frankly, the misunderstanding was in part caused by the title of the paper, which essentially my feeling is that it was placed there to generate this kind of response because it talked about the implausibility of radical life extension. And I think I would qualify this by saying that this is based on what we know today and what we do today. So what was actually mentioned in the discussion and was lost in the brouhaha of the disagreement is the fact that we do not know what the future is made of. And there, as you know, being really actively in the space, as many of us are, there are amazing things happening in the aging field. So no one can actually predict which one of these interventions is going to allow us to, to break that barrier. And that's essentially where I think, something has to be corrected in terms of the paper did not say that radical changes are not going to happen. Frankly, I mean, no one knows. My prediction is that they're probably going to be a little harder than some of our most optimist colleagues would hope, but they're also are probably going to be more significant than many of our detractors are claiming. So
yeah, that's
I try to stand in between, being cautiously optimistic that we're making rapid progress in the discovery of interventions against aging, and no one knows what the future is going to be made.
Yeah, so I guess that we're saying that the data is in the rearview mirror, right? And of course, what we're now looking forward to is a very interesting world of science, which is a confrontation of AI, biotech, some very new thinking, and obviously there are a lot of very interesting elements of the science now that you're looking at. So do you feel, Eric, that we'll be able to break 125? I mean, do you think that we are genetically able to break through 125 as a race?
This is a really tough question.
It is a toughie, yeah.
But by nature, I'm an optimist. I think, but also I'm a realist. So I have been opposed to actually even discussing this because in some way breaking 125 sounds wonderful, but there's one person has lived to 122 and the second oldest has lived to 119. And there's, you can count on a handful or a couple of handful the number of people who have broken 115. So as far as I'm concerned, the real limit seems to be 115, not 125. Now, will we be able to break this in the future? Yes, probably. I'm convinced of this. The question is, how soon is this going to happen? One of the things that is advanced by one group is that, well, the science is moving so quickly that we should anticipate to break this quickly. I think I agree with the fact that the science is moving quickly, but I've also argued that the problems are getting harder and harder to solve. And we do not know. For example, I'll give you an example of some unique cardiomyopathy that is linked to aging with a unique form of amyloidosis. No one knew this existed. Well, it came about, people discovered it. We now have a treatment for this. So as we move in new uncharted territories, I think we can expect to discover a whole set of new problems, the same way we discovered by living to 70 and 80s that we have now the chronic diseases of aging. Frankly, there are likely to be a whole series of additional hurdles as we move older and older. So one of my thinking is that, talking about living above 125 or 115 detracts from the work at hand, which is right now in this country, at least, and soon in the rest of the world, we have a decrease in life expectancy. And I have taken the stand that the field of longevity is for everyone. And so I think there is a lot of work that needs to be done to increase lifespan globally. And we have the answers, many of the answers. And I've said that, most people could expect to live to 90, 95 in good health. That by itself would be such a transformational effect on society, on the way we live right now. For me, that's the goal on which we are focusing a big part of our effort. It doesn't mean that we do not continue to, push the envelope and discover novel interventions. I think all of this work needs to be done, but I think it's also important for us to convey to the public realistic expectations. And quite often, I find that talking about living to 140 today is premature. We have no evidence we're going to be able to do this right now.
Yes.
Doesn't mean we want
just hit 90 healthy, right?
Well, even 95. I mean, that's compares to 65 for most people right now.
Yes.
people do not measure the transformational nature of these changes. And looking at it, it's a bit like I made the analogy to buying a lottery ticket and hoping to win $100 million versus going to work every day and actually making money. So yeah, you can buy the tickets and hope that this is going to happen, but most likely it will not. But it should not detract you from getting your paycheck and living day by day. So we have to balance the two together, and especially we have to manage expectations with the public at the risk of, if we don't do this, at the risk of sort of perpetrating this image that we are a field of charlatan and selling snake oil, basically.
Yeah, well, I guess we haven't heard snake oil as a phrase for a long time in the industry, right? Which is reassuring that hasn't happened for a while. So maybe, Eric, let's just talk a little bit about what those futures look like, because obviously the report in Nature Aging was kind of rearview mirror. You're there at the Buck Institute. You're seeing a lot of very pragmatic work going on, but you're also in conversations with people looking at very exciting work, whether it's genetic engineering, senolytic therapies, epigenetic reprogramming. I could go on, right? So yes. I guess I personally am more interested in how we can look at systemic rejuvenation, because obviously if you're going organ by organ or disease by disease, you're always going to be fighting with like one hand tied behind your back. But are there some therapies or some techniques that you're starting to see come through, obviously preclinical, that you're excited about?
Well, there are so many. I could probably not mention all of them, but I'm struck by the fact that many of the interventions that we have today that are increasing lifespan, many of the pathways that we've identified genetically, all revolve around glucose metabolism and insulin signaling. And I'll give you a few examples. Calorie restriction, the calorie restriction mimetic, metformin, acarbose, the SGLT2 inhibitors, and now the semaglutide and Ozempic, all of these drugs, all showing global, what we could call anti-aging effect. Yes. Now, in the animal models, when, if you go back to the initial work of Cynthia Kenyon and colleagues, major insulin signaling was the major pathway controlling aging in C. elegans, in Drosophila, and many other organisms. So I think that's really one area that I'm really passionate about and focused about. So there's a lot of interest and a lot of things that people can actually do today in this respect. So that would be one area. Another area that I'm passionate about is senescence, obviously, because of the work of Judy Campisi, who was at the Buck Institute, essentially pioneered the whole field and the whole idea of senolytics. I think these are areas that we are still actively working on, and that really show, even though the therapeutic promise has not been realized yet, there's a lot of work going on in this direction. I'm passionate about also, of course, epigenetic reprogramming. In some way has been oversold as a promise for organismal aging. I think it is going to have a major impact in the near to midterm in terms of specific tissue reprogramming, for example, bone marrow and others. In terms of organismal reprogramming, I think it's going to be harder, because then we're confronted by the limitations of our current vectors and transduction systems. But it still is really, really exciting work. And being someone who's worked on epigenetics for now close to 30 years, it is it goes to one of the central tenets of the aging process.
Yeah. And do you think, Eric, that's, everybody talks about a sort of ChatGPT moment in the space now. I think the reality is that we've got the regulators in place, so there's never going to be an accelerated moment in our industry. It's going to be more of a quiet revolution. But do you feel that epigenetic reprogramming, partial reprogramming is kind of going to be one of those potential outliers that may just come around all of these other therapeutic approaches?
I don't think so. I don't think so, because there are so many barriers to implementing a reprogramming at the level of an organism. And knowing what we can do today with our vectors, yes, we can reprogram significantly in vitro. And so any system that would involve an in vitro step, I think, would be used. Administering this to a whole organism, I think, in my opinion, is going to bring some really significant questions that we cannot even comprehend at this point. But it doesn't mean that we should not be trying and should not be working. I just want to sort of temper down the excitement in terms of, well, this is coming because we're going to be using CRISPR. Very nice. You can use CRISPR, but how do you administer CRISPR to most of the cells? Is there an organ that is dominant that we could target? So there are so many questions. Everyone sees the promise. What is not clear is the how do you actually administer it? And how do you make sure that this reprogramming is controlled? We're dealing with some of the core mechanism of cell identity when we reprogram. How much do you reprogram? Are all cells going to be sensitive to the same amount of agents? And are there cells, for example, that when you reprogram them are more likely to turn tumoral, cancerous? And we go back to some of the problems that we've seen in the field for many years in every aspect of the field. Aging is a very fine balance. Most of the curves in terms of interventions versus aging rejuvenation are not linear. And so there's always the danger of going a little bit over. For example, example of calorie restriction. You can quickly fall into malnutrition if you overdo it. The same for exercise. If you exercise too much, eventually you shorten your lifespan. So, and the same, in my opinion, is going to be happening with reprogramming, which remember is a partial reprogramming. So that the partial is really the key terms. If we reprogram too much, you go into an area which is potentially dangerous. And we, at this point, we do not have a full understanding of the implication of this on every cell in the body.
Yeah. And I guess the thing is that this paper that we started our conversation about was in the rearview mirror. And I guess really where we're talking now is the realities of where we may be in 10, 15, 20 years time. I'm not going to ask you to put a timescale on these things, Eric, because I know that's a kind of a cheap question to ask. But what is your thought now? I know you've only got a few more minutes, but culturally, how we manage this as an industry where you've got different tribes of people with different levels of excitement or pragmatism about where we are. What are your thoughts on that?
I think I've been a proponent of the fact that our field is a big tent. Everyone is welcome. Everyone is sort of welcome to voice their opinion. What I sometimes regret is that the solid majority of the working scientists are not expressing their voice enough. And this is why, in some way, I have taken this more public stance to sort of alert the public to some of the limitations and the difficulties that we're facing. Again, I'm not a pessimist. I'm a fundamentally optimistic person. I work with aging for 30 years now. I'm familiar with all of the technology, everything that's coming up. So it's hard not to be excited and optimistic, but we have to manage expectations. And we should not forget what we are here for. It's to increase human health, not just for a few people, but for everybody. So I wish that many of my colleagues, the working scientists, would actually join me and take on a bigger voice in terms of speaking about what we know, and not suppress the voice of other people who are more optimistic, but just give a more balanced view of where the field is going to the general public.
Yeah, well, wise words. And Eric, as always, thanks very much for joining us today. It's a pleasure.
My pleasure. Thank you.